For 5 years, Nate Drummond believed his German Shepherd had vanished from his life forever. Then, one bright winter morning, Kilo was waiting outside a chapel, sealed shut by the county. The old dog did not run into Nate's arms or ask to be taken home. He carried a dead woman's glove and the weight of people who had been too frightened to speak. Behind the chapel doors were contracts, missing funds, and Nate's own signature on work he could not remember approving. To help the town, he would first have to admit how his silence had helped the truth disappear. Tell us where you're watching from, and please like and subscribe as we work toward 5,000 subscribers and continue sharing stories like this. Late January held Bristle Point, Michigan, beneath a kind of winter brightness that made every mistake look farther away than it was. A thin layer of snow covered the rooftops, the cedar fences, and the road that followed the frozen edge of Lake Michigan. Sunlight struck the broken plates of ice near shore and scattered across them in pale flashes. From a distance, the town appeared clean, quiet, almost forgiven. Nate Drummond knew better than to trust appearances. He stood alone in the kitchen of his small house 12 miles outside town, drinking coffee that had gone cold while he studied a handwritten service address on the back of an old invoice. At 50, Nate still had the broad shoulders and solid frame of a man accustomed to lifting more than he should. Years of carrying compressors, climbing ladders, and dragging dead furnaces from narrow basements had built him differently from exercise. His strength looked useful rather than impressive. His face had grown leaner since the divorce. Silver had gathered heavily at both temples, though the rest of his chestnut hair remained dark and fell loosely across his forehead. A short, uneven beard covered his jaw. His hazel eyes, green where the morning light caught them, rested on the address longer than necessary. Mercy Chapel and Rest Gardens. The words were written beneath the name Moses Crane. Nate turned the invoice over as though the blank side might offer a different destination. His phone had rung at 7:12. Moses had not bothered with a greeting. Auxiliary heater in the maintenance room is making a noise like a shopping cart being pushed down a staircase. That specific? I've had time to study it. Call the company under contract. They stopped answering. That should inspire confidence. Your father would have come already. Nate had almost hung up then. Moses Crane had known Gideon Drummond for more than 30 years, which gave him the irritating privilege of using Nate's dead father as both moral instruction and scheduling device. Instead, Nate had said, "I'll be there in 40 minutes." Now he pulled on his olive combat shirt, its fitted body faded from years of washing, the camouflage sleeves marked by horizontal reinforcement bands at the upper arms. Over it went a dark green canvas jacket lined with worn Sherpa. He clipped his old mechanical gloves to his belt, slipped his father's watch beneath his cuff, and carried his toolbox to the truck. The Ford started on the second attempt. That counted as optimism in January. The drive toward Bristle Point took him past bare orchards, low farmhouses, and snowbanks stained gray at the road edges. Nate kept the heater low because one of the vents had begun clicking, and the irony of a former heating contractor driving a truck with a failing vent seemed too obvious to deserve attention. He avoided Mercy Chapel whenever possible. Judith Bell had once spent nearly every Saturday there. Jude organized meal deliveries, helped elderly residents fill out forms, and somehow remembered who needed wool socks, who disliked canned peaches, and who was pretending not to need help. Nate had resented the place because it took her time. Later, after their marriage began breaking apart, he resented it because she looked more alive there than she did at home. He told himself he had avoided the road because it added 7 minutes to the trip into town. 5 years was a long time to keep lying about 7 minutes. The north entrance to Mercy Chapel appeared beyond a stand of pines. The chapel itself was a small, white structure with a narrow steeple, set beside a cemetery that sloped gently toward the lake. Yellow county notices had been fixed across the front doors. Snow lay untouched along the steps. Nate slowed. At first he thought the dark shape near the entrance was a fallen branch. Then it raised its head. A German shepherd sat in the patch of sunlight beside the sealed doors. The dog was old. That was the first thing Nate understood. Black saddle markings crossed a coat that had once been warmer and brighter, though gold still showed along the chest and legs. Silver surrounded the muzzle. The left ear carried a small triangular notch near its tip. When the dog stood, the right hind leg hesitated before taking weight. Nate's foot pressed the brake too hard. The toolbox slid against the passenger door. For several seconds, the engine idled while Nate stared through the windshield. There were facts the body recognized before the mind agreed to them. The shape of the shoulders, the dark line running from the brow toward the muzzle, the way the right ear remained fully forward while the damaged left one tilted slightly outward. Nate opened the truck door without turning off the engine. Cold air rushed inside. The dog watched him step down. Nate stopped beside the front tire. Kilo? The name left him quietly. It did not feel like calling. It felt like admitting something. The German shepherd did not run toward him. No bark split the morning. No tail struck the snow in wild recognition. Kilo stood beside the chapel steps and held Nate's gaze with deep amber eyes that had aged without becoming uncertain. Something hung from his mouth. A knitted glove, blue-gray and worn thin at the fingers. Kilo walked forward 3 steps. His hind leg moved stiffly, but the rest of him remained balanced. He lowered the glove onto the snow between them. Nate's throat tightened. He crouched slowly, though every instinct in him wanted to close the distance at once. "Hey, old boy." Kilo did not retreat. He did not move closer either. Nate held out one bare hand. The dog looked at it, then at Nate's face. His nose shifted once, drawing in the scent of canvas, motor oil, cold metal, and whatever remained of the man he had known 5 years earlier. For one fragile second, Nate thought Kilo might come to him. Instead, the dog picked up the glove, turned, and walked back to the sealed chapel door. The choice hurt more than rejection would have. Rejection belonged to anger. This was simply direction. Kilo placed the glove at the base of the door and sat beside it. Nate crossed the snow slowly. He stopped several feet away and read the faded embroidery near the cuff. Opal Hensley. A voice came from the cemetery. "Well," Moses Crane said, "that explains one mystery and creates at least 4 more." Moses approached along the shoveled path, carrying a red metal thermos and a ring of keys large enough to burden a prison guard. At 72, he was lean and slightly bent through the shoulders, though winter had not softened him. His navy chore coat had faded at the seams. A gray trapper hat covered most of his short white hair, and a thick silver mustache gave his disapproval a permanent residence. He looked from Nate to Kilo. "You know that dog." Nate stayed crouched. "He was mine." Moses stopped. For once he had no immediate reply. Kilo lowered himself beside the glove, head up, one ear turned toward the 2 men. Nate swallowed. Where did he come from? Opal Hensley's place. The name meant little to Nate beyond the glove. Moses studied his face before continuing. She died 3 days ago, peacefully according to Lorna. Her niece found her in the chair by the front window. Dog was lying beside her. Nate looked at Kilo. He lived with her? Nearly 5 years. The number landed with unreasonable force. 5 winters, 5 springs. 5 years during which Nate had driven roads within miles of the dog he had stopped allowing himself to hope was alive. Moses unscrewed the thermos cap. Steam rose into the bright air. After Opal passed, he disappeared from the house. Found him here before sunrise the next morning. Same place yesterday, same place today. Why here? Opal walked him here most mornings before the county sealed the building. Nate glanced at the notices taped across the doors. Kilo's gaze remained fixed on the entrance. "He isn't waiting for me," Nate said. "No." Moses delivered the answer without cruelty. "He's waiting where she used to bring him." Nate rubbed a thumb against the pale band on his left ring finger, a habit he believed he had stopped. The memories came without sequence. Jude standing in their kitchen, asking him to listen instead of solving. Kilo pacing between them as their voices rose. The broken section of backyard fence discovered after midnight. Flyers taped to utility poles. Calls to shelters. Driving back roads until the gas warning light came on. Then Jude moving to Traverse City. Nate leaving Bristle Point for months to close his father's affairs. The house sold. The old phone number disconnected. Two exhausted people, each privately suspecting the other had stopped looking first. "We reported him," Nate said. Moses nodded. "I'm not accusing you." "That almost sounds worse." "It usually does." Nate looked again at the glove. How did nobody scan him? Opal took him to a small clinic outside Mason Ridge. Their scanner was unreliable. Later they found a chip, but the number led to a dead phone and an address that belonged to someone else by then. She posted notices here and at 3 stores. "I wasn't here." "I know." Jude had already moved. "I know that too." Nate gave him a sharp look. Moses drank from the thermos. Small towns remember more than they understand. The cold had begun working through Nate's knees. He stood and brushed snow from his pants. He opened the rear door of the truck, moved an old blanket across the seat, and looked toward Kilo. "Come on." Kilo watched him. Nate patted the seat once. "You'll be warm." The dog rose, but instead of approaching the truck, he picked up Opal's glove and walked around the side of the chapel. Nate followed. Kilo stopped at the maintenance entrance, a narrow steel door half hidden beneath the eave. He placed the glove down and lay beside it. "He's been doing that too," Moses said. "Doing what?" "Choosing the next place I need to look." Nate frowned. "Don't turn him into a prophet." "Wouldn't dream of it. Prophets ask for better coffee." Moses handed him the thermos cap. Nate took one cautious sip and nearly coughed. "That heater may be trying to save us from this." Ungrateful man. Inside the maintenance room, the air smelled of dust, cold masonry, and overheated wiring. Nate set down his toolbox and removed his jacket. The combat shirt beneath it clung close enough for work, and the faded camouflage sleeves carried pale marks from old insulation dust. The auxiliary heater gave a metallic shudder when Moses switched it on. Nate crouched beside the unit, removed the panel, and found a fan bearing nearly seized. That problem was simple. The rest was not. He followed the vent line toward the boiler room and stopped beneath a corroded elbow joint. Rust had eaten around one seam. A newer inspection tag hung nearby, dated 3 years earlier. Nate's expression changed. He checked the main boiler. It was old enough that he remembered ordering replacement parts for the same model when his father was still alive. He opened the fire alarm panel. 2 circuits had been bypassed. Behind him, Moses had gone quiet. "This building wasn't sealed because of one bad heater," Nate said. "No?" "You knew?" "I knew the county found enough to close it. I didn't know what had actually been done." Nothing was done. Nate crossed to a clipboard mounted on the wall. The top sheet listed a full boiler replacement, upgraded venting, and modernization of the fire detection system. The work had supposedly been completed 3 years earlier. He read the contractor line once, then again. Drummond Mechanical and Property Services. His own company name sat beneath the total. Below it was a copied signature that looked almost like his. Almost. Moses stood a few feet away, thermos held against his chest. Nate removed the page from the clipboard. The paper made a soft, ordinary sound. That was the worst part. "Opal kept asking me something before she died," Moses said. Nate did not look up. "What?" "She bought a grave beside her husband 12 years ago, paid in full. Then a funeral arrangement company told her the old agreement was no longer valid." Nate's fingers tightened around the form. "Which company?" "Ever Peace Arrangement Services." The name was familiar, though he could not yet place where he had seen it. Moses continued. "She wanted to know how a person could pay for the same resting place twice and still be told it might belong to someone else." Outside the small window, Kilo lay between the maintenance door and Opal's glove. Sunlight warmed the gold in his coat. His eyes were open. Nate looked from the false work order to the old dog who had lived 5 years inside a life Nate knew nothing about. For years he had imagined finding Kilo as a correction. A lost thing returned. Proof that not every door he had allowed to close stayed closed forever. But Kilo had not come back empty, waiting to become Nate's again. He had arrived carrying another person's grief. And beneath Nate's own name, something in Mercy Chapel had already begun to rot. Nate stayed in the maintenance room long after Moses stopped talking. The false work order lay across the workbench between them. Morning light entered through the small wired glass window and divided the page into pale squares. The company name was printed correctly. The old address was correct. Even the license number belonged to Drummond Mechanical and Property Services. Only the work itself was a lie. Kilo remained outside the door with Opal's glove between his front paws. Nate read the form again. Full boiler replacement, ventilation upgrade, fire detection modernization. He knew the cost of each item. He knew how many workers the job would have required, how long the building would have smelled of solder and fresh insulation, how many discarded parts would have filled the service yard. None of it had happened. Moses leaned against a cabinet, his red thermos balanced in one hand. "You planning to stare the ink into confessing?" "I'm checking whether it changes." "Any luck?" "It becomes more insulting every time." Nate placed the sheet down. "I'll look at Opal's paperwork. That's all. I'm not a detective. I'm not going door to door accusing people of fraud." Moses nodded with such immediate agreement that Nate distrusted it. "I don't need a detective." "What do you need?" "A man who can tell a new boiler from one that has survived 4 presidents and a raccoon." Nate looked toward the old unit. "There was a raccoon?" "Briefly." "What happened?" "It developed standards and left." That was how Moses persuaded people. He never pushed directly when he could stand still and make refusal feel more tiring than cooperation. He unlocked a dented steel cabinet at the back of the room. Inside were 4 cardboard archive boxes, their lids bowed with age. Each had been marked in Moses's square handwriting. Complaint copies, old plot maps, service records, vehicle logs. Nate folded his arms. "You kept all this here?" "Copies. Nothing stolen, nothing confidential I wasn't given. People brought letters to me when the office stopped calling them back." "And nobody asked why you kept them?" "People rarely ask an old man what he carries unless they think it's too heavy." Moses lifted the first box onto the workbench. Mercy Chapel and Rest Gardens had never been a funeral home. The nonprofit maintained the chapel, the adjoining cemetery, a perpetual care fund, and a modest burial assistance program for residents who could not afford full services. For decades, it had survived through donations, volunteer labor, and the sort of bookkeeping that depended too heavily on everyone being honest. 6 years earlier, the board had hired Ever Peace Arrangement Services to modernize operations. Ever Peace handled prepaid burial consultations, scheduling, document renewals, and coordination with outside funeral homes. The arrangement had sounded efficient, The chapel's board members were aging, the administrative office was understaffed, and Byron Sedgwick had arrived with polished brochures and the vocabulary of reassurance. Moses pulled out a cream-colored folder. Opals. Inside were 2 contracts for the same cemetery plot. The first was 12 years old. It listed a space beside Opal's husband, Walter Hensley, and carried the signature of the former cemetery administrator. The second, issued after Everpeace took over, was labeled a continuity of interment rights agreement. Nate read the phrase twice. That means nothing. It meant $1,800. The second contract claimed that older ownership records required revalidation under the new management structure. It did not explicitly say Opal would lose the plot. Instead, it used language about delayed verification, future administrative disputes, and the possibility that placement could not be guaranteed without updated registration. Nothing on the page shouted. Every sentence leaned. Nate imagined Opal sitting across from someone who spoke gently, explaining that the payment was not a second purchase, but protection against confusion later. He imagined the contract being turned toward her with a pen placed neatly beside the signature line. Did she pay all of it? 3 installments. She complained? Repeatedly. Moses showed him copies of letters. Opal's handwriting was small, but firm. She asked why her original deed was no longer sufficient. She requested a written explanation. She asked whether the payment could be refunded. One response from Everpeace thanked her for her patience and referred her back to the terms she had signed. Another invited her to schedule a consultation regarding additional legacy protections. Nate set the letter down. They tried to sell her more. They called it helping. That afternoon, Nate drove Moses to Opal's neighborhood. Kilo rode in the back seat on an old rubber-backed mat Nate had taken from the garage. The dog had refused the truck earlier, but when Moses opened the rear door and placed Opal's glove on the seat, Kilo stepped in without looking at Nate. The distinction mattered. Nate drove carefully over the frozen roads. Kilo braced himself at turns, the right hind leg slow to adjust. At the first stop, Nate added a folded blanket beneath the mat to raise the dog away from the cold floor. Kilo watched the movement, but offered no approval. Their first visit was to Marjorie Pell. She lived in a narrow blue house with white shutters and a porch crowded with ceramic birds half buried in snow. At 76, Marjorie was small, neatly dressed, and unwilling to let anyone cross her threshold until they stamped the snow from their boots twice. Her white hair curved softly around her ears. A silver sparrow brooch rested at the collar of her lavender-gray quilted jacket. She recognized Moses. She recognized Kilo more quickly. "Oh," she said, and one hand rose to her chest. "Opal's boy." Kilo entered slowly, sniffed the edge of the rug, and stopped several feet from her. Marjorie knelt as far as her knees allowed. "I heard she was gone." Moses removed his hat. 3 days now. Marjorie looked toward the window. For a moment, Nate thought the visit would end there. Then Kilo crossed the room and lay beside her chair, not touching her, simply close enough that she could lower one hand onto the gold fur behind his ear. Nate remained near the door. Moses explained that they were reviewing old complaints connected to Everpeace. He did not mention fraud. He did not promise recovery. He only asked whether Marjorie still had the paperwork she had once shown Opal. Her fingers tightened in Kilo's fur. "I paid for a preservation package," she said. "What was being preserved?" Nate asked. "My husband." The answer stopped him. Marjorie gave a small, embarrassed laugh. "Not him exactly. His ashes. The niche at the chapel." She rose, went to a side table, and returned with a purple document pouch. Byron Sedgwick had told her that older chapel storage agreements did not include enhanced environmental protection. Without a new package, future building repairs might require temporary relocation of the urn. Did he say they would move it? Nate asked. Not directly. Did he say they wouldn't? Marjorie looked down. No. That was the method. No open threat, only a door left slightly ajar, with fear invited to enter on its own. I knew it sounded wrong, she said. But what was I supposed to risk? My husband hated being moved even when he was alive. The line held a trace of humor, but her eyes had filled. Nate wanted to tell her she had done nothing foolish. The words felt too easy. Instead, he asked permission to copy the contract. She agreed only after Moses promised the original would not leave the house. Before they left, Marjorie took a small biscuit from a tin and offered it to Kilo. The dog looked toward Nate. It was the first time he had done that. Nate nodded once. Kilo accepted the biscuit. The gesture lasted less than a second, but it changed something small and private between them. Not trust, perhaps only acknowledgement. Their second visit was to Vernon Hale, a retired mathematics teacher who lived in a brick duplex near the old water tower. Vernon was 81, tall even with the slight curve in his back, and dressed as though he expected a school inspector. A mustard sweater vest covered a checked shirt. A tweed cap rested on the table beside a calculator old enough to have survived several educational reforms. He did not offer anyone coffee. Nate respected him immediately. Vernon arranged 5 contracts across the dining table. My own, my sister's, 2 neighbors, and 1 belonging to a man who died before he could complain. The documents appeared different. Different dates, different service descriptions, different fees. Vernon tapped the lower right corner of each page with a silver mechanical pencil. Processing code. The same 8 digits appeared on all 5. That could be a department code, Nate said. It could, Vernon replied. Except the agreement dates span 19 months, and Everpeace's own brochure states every contract receives an individual transaction number. He slid a handwritten chart across the table. Vernon had recorded dates, amounts, plot references, and processing numbers in narrow columns. Several codes repeated. In 2 cases, the same plot had been listed under different administrative categories. They assumed no one would compare paperwork, Vernon said. They assumed correctly for a while, Moses replied. Vernon's eyes sharpened. I am old, Mr. Crane. I am not decorative. No one said you were. People rarely say it. They use a different voice. Nate understood that voice, the careful volume, the softened words, the false patience people used when age made them believe a person's mind had become public property. Vernon pushed 1 contract toward him. You repaired the chapel? I worked there. That was not my question. Nate looked at the page. His company name appeared on a facility surcharge notice attached to Vernon's agreement. I did some maintenance, Nate said. Not what these documents claim. Vernon held his gaze. Then decide quickly whether that makes you a witness or an excuse. Moses shifted in his chair, but Nate did not look away. I'm still figuring that out. At least that is an honest answer. Their final visit ended at the doorway. The man who answered was named Calvin Rusk. He was in his late 70s, broad-faced and exhausted, wearing a cardigan over pajama pants despite the afternoon hour. Behind him, an oxygen concentrator hummed somewhere inside the house. His wife was seriously ill. Calvin listened until Moses mentioned Everpeace, then stepped outside and pulled the door nearly closed behind him. I'm not filing anything. We're only asking what happened, Nate said. What happened is my wife has a burial agreement, and I need it honored when the time comes. If the agreement is wrong, if I make trouble, they can delay it. They may not have that power. May not? The 2 words carried more weight than anger. Nate had no answer that would not sound like a promise he lacked the authority to make. Calvin glanced through the narrow opening of the door. I cannot spend the next months fighting over what happens after the worst day of my life. He went inside. The lock turned. Back in the truck, nobody spoke for several minutes. Kilo settled on the blanket, head near the door. Nate looked toward the house. That's how they kept people quiet. Moses rubbed warmth into his hands. Not quiet. Busy being afraid of something else. By late afternoon, they returned to the maintenance room with copies, notes, and 3 new questions for every answer they had found. Moses poured coffee into the thermos cap. Nate smelled it and recoiled. Could this qualify as elder abuse? I'm older than you, so technically you're the victim. This has been in that thermos since sunrise. Longer? Nate stared at him. Moses took the cup back. No one who drinks it has ever returned to complain. That is not the defense you think it is. The humor faded when Nate opened the box labeled service records. He arranged invoices by date and compared them with the chapel's maintenance logs. Several jobs had been billed at 3 or 4 times their likely value. One invoice listed replacement of 6 exterior heating units in a storage wing that had only 2. Another claimed Nate's company had completed electrical upgrades in the archive building. Nate had never entered the archive building. He moved faster now, separating pages into piles. Work performed. Work exaggerated. Work impossible. Moses watched without interrupting. Near the bottom of the box, Nate found a packet of completion forms. The first signature was obviously copied. The line thickness was too uniform, the final stroke cut short. The second looked wrong. The third did not. Nate held it near the window. He remembered signing forms like this in batches at the end of long weeks. The page contained a standard maintenance confirmation. The description field had likely been incomplete when it reached him, but the signature was his. So was the next one. And the next. Not every document carried a forgery. Some carried evidence of a man too tired, too distracted, or too eager to be done to ask what he was placing his name beneath. Nate set the papers down carefully. Moses did not offer comfort. That was one reason Nate trusted him. How many? Moses asked. Enough? Enough for what? Nate looked at the 3 piles. Enough to understand that Everpeace had built its system from more than deception. It had also used ordinary carelessness, overworked people, weak oversight, and the belief that no one would ever place all the pages side by side. He had spent the day listening to people describe the price of fear. Now his own signature sat among the costs. I'm not outside this, Nate said. Kilo raised his head from beside the door. Nate looked at him, but the dog's amber eyes offered neither judgment nor rescue. Only attention. For the moment, that was harder to bear. The garage behind Nate's house had once been the busiest place on the property. Years earlier, vans had backed into the gravel lot before sunrise. Men shouted measurements through open doors. Radios played beneath the grinding of metal and the cough of old engines. In winter, the air carried the smells of propane, wet canvas, solder, and coffee boiled past forgiveness. Now the building held silence in layers. Dust covered the workbench. A yellow extension cord hung from the wall in the same loop Nate had left it after closing Drummond Mechanical and Property Services. Shelves still carried pipe fittings sorted by size, though the labels had faded. 3 ladders leaned together like men waiting for instructions from a foreman who no longer came. Nate unlocked the records cabinet and dragged out the first plastic storage bin. Kilo lay near the open doorway where the weak afternoon sun reached the concrete. Opal's blue-gray glove rested beneath his chin. The dog had eaten that morning, accepted water, and allowed Nate to check the stiffness in his right hind leg. He had not followed Nate into the house. The garage, apparently, was acceptable. Nate could not decide whether that counted as progress. He opened the bin. Inside were contracts, payroll records, insurance certificates, equipment receipts, and the old maintenance agreement with Mercy Chapel and Rest Gardens. The agreement was thicker than he remembered. Drummond Mechanical had been responsible not only for heating systems, but also winter inspections, emergency repairs, vendor coordination, and completion reports for smaller subcontracted jobs. That explained why his company name appeared across so many files. It did not explain why work he had never seen had been billed beneath it. Nate cleared a section of the bench and began sorting. The first group contained real jobs. A circulation pump replaced in the chapel basement. Roof flashing repaired over the records room. 2 damaged exterior lights rewired by a licensed subcontractor. The prices on the Mercy copies, however, were higher than the amounts in Nate's own invoices. Not slightly higher. In one case, nearly triple. The second group was more difficult. Completion forms carried Nate's real signature, but the descriptions did not match the versions in his files. Several referred to appendices that were not attached. Others listed project numbers written in a different ink. Nate remembered signing forms in batches. He remembered Byron Sedgwick standing at this very workbench in a camel coat too clean for the garage, arranging documents into neat stacks while Nate answered phone calls from suppliers. The company had been bleeding money then. 2 clients were late on payment. 1 technician had quit without notice. Gideon Drummond had died less than a month earlier, leaving Nate with his father's tools, debts, and a watch that still lost 3 minutes every week. At home, Jude had stopped asking when he would return. She had begun asking whether he intended to. Byron had said the paperwork was routine. The board needed signatures before the quarterly meeting. The appendices were still being copied. Nate had signed where the tabs indicated. He had not signed blank pages. That distinction comforted him for almost 10 seconds. Then he found the third group. These signatures were wrong. One curved too smoothly through the final letters. Another copied a version of his name from years earlier, before he had shortened the upward stroke in the D. The company seal appeared on documents dated after Nate had locked it inside the records cabinet. Someone had copied the signature and used the stamp after the work was supposedly complete. Nate sat on the edge of the bench. Kilo raised his head. "There," Nate said, holding up the page as though the dog had asked for evidence. "That one isn't mine." Kilo watched him. Nate placed the forged form on the left side of the table. Then he looked at the pages on the right. Those were his. The difference between being deceived and being careless had seemed enormous until both kinds of paper occupied the same bench. By sunset, he had created 3 piles, performed and inflated, signed incomplete, forged or altered. The second pile was the smallest. It felt the heaviest. Moses arrived after dark wearing his faded navy chore coat and carrying the red thermos. He paused at the garage entrance, studied the documents, and did not step inside until Nate waved him through. "You've made progress," Moses said. "I've made categories." "People call that progress when they want funding." Nate pointed toward the thermos. "Keep that closed." Moses set it down anyway. He examined the piles without touching them. "How bad?" "Some of it is clear forgery." "And the rest?" Nate folded his arms. "The rest is complicated." That word has protected a lot of uncomplicated wrongdoing. Nate looked at him sharply. Moses met the look without apology. "I didn't steal anything." "I didn't say you did." "I didn't know what Byron was doing." "I believe that." Nate had expected resistance. Agreement left him with nowhere useful to push. Moses took off his trapper hat and brushed snow from the crown. "Believing you didn't know doesn't mean believing you did enough." The garage seemed colder after that. Nate turned back to the papers. Moses gave him the name of a legal aid attorney in town. "Denise Halbrook," he said. "She handles elder law, benefits disputes, predatory contracts. Opal spoke to her once, but she didn't have enough documents to show a pattern. I don't need a lawyer. That opinion has improved many lawyers' incomes. I'm not hiring anyone." You're taking records to someone who knows what records can do. Nate shook his head. I can explain what happened. To whom? The question stopped him. Moses continued more quietly. You keep talking as though the problem is convincing me. The next morning, Nate drove into Bristle Point with 2 boxes in the truck bed and Kilo on the back seat. Denise Hallbrook's office occupied the second floor of an old brick building above a pharmacy. The waiting room had no polished marble, dramatic shelves, or paintings of stern judges. It had 3 chairs, a coat rack, a humming radiator, and a sign asking clients not to sign anything they did not understand. Denise came out carrying a yellow legal pad. She was 58, broad-shouldered and composed, with short black curls threaded with silver. Burgundy frames sharpened the focus of her dark eyes. A small silver scale pin rested on the lapel of her charcoal cardigan. She looked at Moses first, then at Nate, then at the boxes. Which one of you brought me a problem too large for the elevator? Moses pointed at Nate. He owns the boxes. Used to own the company, Nate said. Denise opened the office door. That sounds like a sentence with a second half. Inside, she asked Nate to explain without interruption. He described the maintenance contract, the invoices, the forged signatures, the incomplete appendices, and the repeated charges connected to Everpeace. He expected questions about Byron. Denise began with him. Who had access to your company seal? Me, my office manager. Occasionally, the bookkeeper. Where was it stored? Locked cabinet. Who had keys? Nate hesitated. More people than should have. Did you reconcile completion forms against final invoices? Usually. Usually is not a procedure. We were a small company. So were many of the people who trusted your paperwork. Nate leaned back. Moses remained silent in the chair beside the door. Denise selected one of the forms carrying Nate's real signature. You sign this. The description was added later. Can you prove that? I have my copy. That may help. It does not make the signature disappear. Byron altered the documents. Possibly. Possibly? Denise removed her glasses and cleaned them with the edge of a cloth. I am not an investigator. I cannot subpoena accounts, freeze funds, or declare fraud because the situation feels dishonest. I can advise affected clients, preserve records, prepare complaints, and refer a pattern to the proper state office. She put the glasses back on. And I can tell you where your risk begins. Nate's jaw tightened. I didn't know. Knowledge matters. So does negligence. That sounds like you've decided already. It sounds like I'm refusing to tell you what you came here hoping to hear. The words landed with more force because she never raised her voice. Kilo had settled beside the office door. When Nate shifted forward, the dog lifted his head but did not move toward him. Denise noticed. Your dog? Nate looked at Kilo. Not exactly. Moses said, that sentence also has a second half. Nate ignored him. Denise returned to the documents. If you cooperate, you need to understand what cooperation means. Not just the forged forms. Not just the pages that make Byron look guilty. Everything. You think I should hand over records that could cost me my license. I think selective honesty becomes another kind of alteration. For several seconds, the only sound in the room came from the radiator ticking beneath the window. Nate looked at the 3 sample folders on Denise's desk. One contained obvious forgeries, one contained inflated invoices, the third contained his real signature. He had spent years believing responsibility required certainty. A man admitted fault only after he knew exactly how much belonged to him and how much belonged elsewhere. Denise was asking him to step forward before the numbers were safe. That afternoon, Nate returned to the garage and worked until the sky turned dark. He did not call Jude immediately. He found her name first. It appeared in a volunteer schedule Moses had copied from Mercy Chapel. Judith Bell had assisted with senior meal deliveries and document review sessions during the period Everpeace began offering private consultations. Nate stared at her old handwriting in the margin. Client uncomfortable. Asked volunteer to leave room. No name beside the note, only a date. He checked it against one of the earliest Everpeace contracts. The dates matched. Nate carried his phone into the kitchen. Kilo remained in the garage, visible through the open connecting door. Jude answered on the 5th ring. "Hello?" Her voice had changed less than Nate expected. He nearly hung up. "Nate?" "Yeah?" Silence stretched between Michigan towns, old arguments, and 2 years without a single call. "What happened?" she asked. The question was practical, not tender. "I found Kilo." Nothing came through the line. Then Jude inhaled sharply. "Alive?" "He's old, but yes." "Where?" "With a woman named Opal Hensley. She died 3 days ago." Jude said nothing for so long that Nate checked the screen. "You knew?" he asked. "No." Her answer came hard. "I never knew." "I didn't say—" "You were about to." Nate closed his eyes. "No, I wasn't." "You always paused before accusing me, like silence made it fair." He looked through the doorway at Kilo. The dog had lowered his head again, Opal's glove beneath one paw. Nate forced himself not to defend the past. "Mercy Chapel is involved in something," he said. "Bad contracts, maintenance charges, Everpeace." Jude's tone shifted, though it did not soften. "What kind of contracts?" He explained enough. When he mentioned Byron Sedgwick, she spoke immediately. "I remember him." "You met him?" "He ran consultation days. He'd bring folders, bottled water, little packets of tissues. Made everything look gentle." "Did you notice anything?" "I noticed he kept asking volunteers to leave before signatures." "Did you report it?" "I told the chapel coordinator. I told you too." Nate leaned against the counter. "When?" "You were repairing the south roof. I said something felt wrong about the way he isolated people." He remembered the conversation only after she described it. Jude at the kitchen table with volunteer forms spread around her. Nate answering emails while she spoke. Her saying that someone should look more closely. His reply arriving now with perfect clarity. "You cannot save the whole town, Jude." The sentence had sounded reasonable when he said it. Now it seemed designed only to make concern feel embarrassing. "I dismissed you," Nate said. "Yes?" No anger. That was worse. "I thought you were taking on too much again." "You thought that whenever caring required anything from you." Nate pressed his palm against the counter. Jude continued. "I left Bristle Point 2 months before Opal found Kilo. I stopped following Mercy after that. Not because I didn't care, because every street there felt like proof I had failed at something." "We both looked for him." "I know." "We should have looked longer." "I know that too." Her voice cracked slightly on the last word, then steadied. Nate did not tell her Kilo had refused his truck at first. He did not describe the distance the dog kept. Those details felt private to Kilo, not his to spend. "Would you talk to a lawyer?" he asked. "About Byron?" "About what you saw." Jude took a breath. "Yes?" Not for Nate, for the people she remembered. He understood the difference. After the call, Nate stood in the kitchen until the room darkened around him. Kilo appeared in the doorway. The dog did not come farther. Nate lowered himself to sit on the floor beside the cabinet, leaving several feet between them. "I found you," he said. Kilo's ears shifted. "That doesn't mean I get to rewrite what happened before." The dog watched him for a while, then turned and returned to the garage. Nate remained on the floor. The next morning, Denise called. She had reviewed the materials Nate left behind. Several transfers from Mercy's operating fund had been labeled as facility improvement projects. The payees included subcontractors Nate did not recognize, yet Drummond Mechanical appeared as the coordinating contractor. Some payments had passed through his business account. They were bundled payments, Nate said. We paid subcontractors after the client paid us. Did your company retain a coordination fee? Yes. How much? I'll have to calculate it. You need to calculate all of it. Nate looked toward the garage. The remaining boxes waited on the bench. He could separate them. Take only the forged documents. Keep the incomplete forms and payment records until he knew what they might cost him. No one had asked how many boxes existed. No one but Moses. And Kilo, perhaps, though the dog had shown no interest in paperwork and considerably better judgment than most people who did. Nate carried the first box to the truck, then the second, then the cabinet files, payroll folders, bank statements, and the old company seal. He loaded everything. When he closed the tailgate, Kilo stood at the edge of the driveway. Nate opened the rear passenger door. He did not call. He did not pat the seat. He simply waited. Kilo looked back toward the garage where Opal's glove lay on the folded blanket Nate had prepared. Nate retrieved it and placed it on the rear mat. The dog approached slowly. His right hind leg stiffened as he climbed, but he refused Nate's hand and completed the movement himself. Once inside, Kilo turned in a careful circle and settled beside the glove. Nate closed the door gently. It was not forgiveness. It was not a return to the life they had lost. It was one old dog choosing, for a single morning, not to let Nate carry the whole truth alone. Lorna Hensley Ward arrived from Grand Rapids under a winter sky so bright it made the snow around Opal's house look almost blue. She parked beside the narrow driveway, stepped out, and stood with one hand resting on the roof of her rust-brown SUV. At 59, Lorna was a compact woman with auburn hair cut at her chin, silver threading heavily through the front. A brick-red scarf covered the collar of her long coat. Her face held the exhausted orderliness of someone who had spent 3 days signing forms while trying not to think about what the forms meant. Nate waited near the porch with Moses and Denise. Kilo stood beside the truck. The dog had been unsettled since dawn. He had eaten only a few bites, paced between the kitchen and the front door, and lifted his head each time a vehicle passed Nate's house. When Nate opened the truck, Kilo had climbed inside without being called. Now his attention fixed on Opal's front steps. Lorna noticed him before she noticed Nate. Her guarded expression broke. "Kilo!" The dog crossed the yard. Age kept him from running, but urgency entered every step. His right hind leg lagged once on the packed snow. He recovered without slowing, reached Lorna, and pressed his broad forehead against her chest. Lorna bent around him. For several seconds, she held the dog without speaking. Nate looked toward the road. He had once imagined Kilo greeting him that way. The old wish returned, but it carried no resentment now. What hurt was not that Kilo loved someone else. It was proof that 5 missing years had contained an entire life. Lorna straightened and wiped beneath one eye with her glove. "You're Nate Drummond." "Yes?" "The man who used to own him." Nate looked at Kilo. "I was part of his life." "That is not quite the same answer." "No?" Her eyes remained on him. "My aunt found him without a collar. She took him to a clinic. She posted notices. She did not steal your dog." "I know." "You say that quickly." "Because I came here for her papers, not to accuse her." Lorna glanced at the document case in Denise's hand. "And those papers might protect you." "They might hurt him," Denise said, before Nate could answer. Lorna turned. Denise introduced herself and explained her role. Nothing would be removed without written consent. Originals would remain with the estate. Any copies would be logged and used only in connection with the complaints involving Mercy Chapel and Everpeace. Lorna listened with her arms folded. What happens if the papers make Nate look innocent? Then they make him look innocent. And if they do not, then they do not. Lorna studied Denise for a moment, apparently reassured by the absence of comfort in the answer. She unlocked the house. The rooms were colder than Nate expected. Someone had lowered the furnace after Opal died, leaving a chill in the furniture and walls. The air smelled faintly of wool, old books, and the lavender polish used on the wooden floor. A pair of brown slippers rested beneath a chair beside the front window. Kilo walked directly to them. He did not search the rooms. He did not bark or pull toward a hidden corner. He circled once beside the chair, lowered himself, and rested his muzzle across the slippers. Lorna stopped halfway through, removing her coat. "He keeps waiting there?" "He has been returning to the chapel," Moses said. "This is the first time he has been back inside." Nate filled the familiar ceramic water bowl near the kitchen doorway. A pale crescent marked the floor where years of movement had worn through the finish. He set the bowl exactly inside that mark. Kilo did not rise. Nate opened a container of food and placed it beside the water. Still nothing. "He ate at your house?" Lorna asked. "Some. He always ate at 7. It's after 10. He waited for Opal to sit down first." Nate looked toward the empty chair. He understood then. Kilo was not refusing food because the house frightened him. He was waiting for a routine that could no longer be completed. Nate took a chair from the wall and placed it beside Opal's, but he did not sit in her place. He lowered himself several feet away and opened the food container on the floor. Kilo looked at him. Nate turned his face toward the window. After a minute, the dog stood and ate 3 careful mouthfuls. No one spoke while he did. The silence no longer felt like absence. It had become courtesy. They did not begin with drawers or boxes. Moses checked the pipes. Nate restarted the furnace and listened until the circulation pump settled. Lorna opened curtains and folded blankets. Denise sat at the kitchen table with her case closed. Only after the house had warmed did Lorna bring out the first calendar. It was 5 years old, filled with small blue handwriting. Vet, 10:30. Marge, read renewal letter. Walter's birthday. Kilo stiff after long walk. Called Mercy, left message. The next calendar held more names. The third contained payment dates, medication schedules, weather notes, and reminders to carry extra biscuits when visiting Vernon Hale. Nothing had been organized as evidence. Opal had simply recorded her days. That made the pattern more human and, in some ways, more convincing. Lorna sat across from Denise and turned one calendar slowly. "I called her," she said. "Not often enough, but I called." "No one has said otherwise," Denise replied. "She always told me everything was fine." Moses opened a cupboard and found tea. "Fine has ruined more families than anger," he said. Lorna's mouth tightened. "I thought she wanted space." "Perhaps she thought you were busy," Denise said. "I was busy." "That does not mean you did not care." Lorna looked toward Opal's chair. "No, it only made caring very convenient." Nate felt the words before he understood why. He had once called distance respect. Jude had called it leaving. Lorna opened another notebook. The cover had one word written across it: Kilo. The first pages listed food brands and veterinary appointments. Later entries described the dog waking Opal during nights when her breathing turned shallow, lying beside her during panic attacks, and refusing to leave the bedroom until she settled. Bad night, woke at 2:15. Kilo pressed against bed until breathing slowed. Went to Marjorie. She cried before opening letter. Kilo stayed beside chair. Vernon found numbers wrong. Kilo stole biscuit. Matter unresolved. Nate smiled despite himself. "He always preferred oatmeal." Lorna looked at him. "You remember that?" "He used to carry them into the laundry room before eating." "Why?" "I never figured it out." Lorna's expression softened by a degree. It was not trust, but suspicion was no longer the only thing in the room. Moses found a bundle of returned envelopes in the writing desk. Several bore Nate's old address. One contained a photograph of Kilo sitting beside Opal's porch, younger, heavier through the chest, his muzzle still mostly dark. On the back, Opal had written, "Found near County Road 8. Male shepherd. Knows sit, stay, door, and waits before eating. Someone taught him gently." The date was 5 months after Kilo disappeared. Nate read it twice. 5 months, not years after hope had become unreasonable. 5 months after the broken fence. 5 months after flyers curled beneath rain. 5 months after Jude moved away and Nate left town to settle his father's affairs. Opal had reached toward him. The letter had reached a vacant house. Lorna watched him holding the photograph. She tried. "I know." She did not keep him because she wanted someone else's dog. "I know." "You keep saying that." Nate set the photograph down carefully. "Because every explanation I give starts sounding like a defense." The room grew still. Kilo lifted his head from the slippers. Lorna looked at Nate for a long time, then placed the returned letters beside the calendars rather than putting them back in the drawer. It was a small decision. It allowed him to remain at the table. Over the next 4 days, they returned to the house in shifts. Nate repaired the loose latch on the back door and brought Kilo's medication. Moses checked the property each evening. Lorna remained in Bristle Point to manage the estate. Some nights Kilo went home with Nate. Other nights he refused to leave Opal's chair, and Lorna slept on the couch nearby. Nate did not command him. The dog's grief had rules that belonged to no one else. With Lorna's written permission, Denise copied the relevant pages. Opal had reported her burial contract to local police and been told it appeared to be a civil dispute. She wrote to the Mercy Board, which forwarded her complaint to Everpeace for internal review. She contacted a state consumer office, but lacked full copies of the original agreement. Several people withdrew their complaints after receiving refunds. The refunds looked generous until Denise noticed the attached confidentiality clauses. They did not correct the problem, she said. They isolated it. Opal had refused to sign. In the margin, she had written, "If it was an honest mistake, why must honesty stay private?" The calendars also revealed what Kilo had done during those years. He accompanied Opal to Marjorie's house when she was too frightened to read another letter alone. He sat near Vernon while the retired teacher compared numbers. He waited outside Mercy Chapel while Opal asked again about Walter's grave. He woke her during nights when grief became physical and stood between her and the door when unfamiliar salesmen arrived. Kilo had not spent 5 years waiting for Nate. He had been useful, needed, loved. One afternoon, Nate found Moses outside, stacking split wood beneath the porch overhang. "I kept thinking he got lost," Nate said. Moses placed another log on the pile. "He did, but he found someone." Those things can both be true. Nate looked through the window at Kilo, sleeping beside Opal's chair. "I thought if I found him, it would mean something had been given back." Moses brushed bark from his gloves. "Maybe you found out it was never only yours." The sentence carried no accusation. That made it difficult to resist. Inside the final calendar, Denise found repeated references to Celia Brandt, the former treasurer of Mercy Chapel. Celia had approved facility transfers during the first years of Everpeace's contract. Opal's notes suggested she later questioned several subcontractors and payment codes but refused to speak publicly. One entry read, "Celia says Byron saved Mercy when no one else would. Says if records are wrong, she signed them. Afraid they will say she stole." Nate read the line again. "She knew enough to be afraid," he said. "She may also know enough to help," Denise replied, "or enough to protect herself. Those are not always separate motives." Nate understood that better than he wanted to. Celia had not created the scheme. She had believed the organization needed Byron. Then she had found irregularities and remained quiet because exposing them would expose her own approvals. Nate had done less. He had also done something similar. Late that afternoon, a courier envelope arrived at Nate's house. No return address appeared on the front. Inside was a letter from Byron Sedgwick's attorney. The language was courteous. Everpeace regretted administrative confusion concerning Opal Hensley's burial rights. The company was prepared to issue a full refund to her estate, confirm the original plot assignment, and correct contractor records connected to Drummond Mechanical. In exchange, Nate would sign a statement describing the inconsistencies as clerical errors discovered during routine review. The letter also offered assistance in resolving any licensing concerns arising from the disputed forms. Byron was not threatening him. He was offering relief. That made the proposal more dangerous. Nate carried the letter to Denise's office the next morning. Kilo waited beside the door while Denise read. "This could reduce your exposure," she said. "I know." "It could also return Opal's money." "I know." Denise set the page down. "What do you want me to tell you?" "That it's a trap." "It is an agreement. Whether it is a trap depends on what you are willing to exchange." Nate looked through the glass at Kilo. The dog lay with Opal's glove between his paws. If Nate signed, Opal's estate would be restored. His company name might be cleaned. The worst forms could be dismissed as errors. Marjorie would still have her contract. Calvin would still be afraid. The other names in Opal's calendars would remain separated into small, survivable complaints. Nate took Denise's pen. He wrote one sentence across the signature page. "I will not describe deliberate omissions as clerical errors." Then he signed his name beneath a full statement that included the incomplete forms, the coordination fees, the real signatures, and the records that could cost him his license. His hand remained steady. That surprised him, too. Denise witnessed the statement and sealed it with the supporting documents. When Nate stepped into the hallway, Kilo stood. The dog did not move toward him immediately. Nate crouched and held out no hand. After a moment, Kilo crossed the short distance and rested his muzzle briefly against Nate's shoulder. It lasted only a few seconds. Then the dog returned to the door. Nate did not mistake the gesture for absolution. Kilo had spent 5 years teaching lonely people that being present did not require erasing what had happened. For once, Nate was beginning to learn. Laurel Venn did not ask Nate whether he considered himself a good man. She asked for the number of people who had access to his company seal in March of that year. The interview took place in a borrowed conference room inside the Bristle Point Municipal Building, where a radiator clanged beneath the window and someone had taped a handwritten sign above the light switch asking people not to turn it off during winter. Laurel sat opposite Nate with a black recorder aligned precisely with the edge of the table. At 55, she had a long rectangular face, steel blue eyes, and ash blonde hair cut in a short bob that exposed the clean line of her jaw. Her charcoal green utility coat hung behind her. She wore no visible badge, only a state identification card clipped inside a folder. Before every difficult question, she tapped the end of her pen twice. "Who had access to the seal?" she repeated. "My office manager, the bookkeeper." "Me?" "Names." Nate gave them. "Could Byron Sedgwick enter the records room alone?" "Not officially." "That is not the same as no." "No." "Did you ever leave him there?" Nate searched his memory. "Once, maybe twice." "Why?" "Phone calls, deliveries. I was running the company." Laurel wrote something down. That phrase explains activity. It does not explain procedure. Nate almost smiled. Denise had said something similar. The women might have disliked one another if they had not agreed so efficiently about him. 3 boxes of Drummond Mechanical records sat on the floor beside the wall. Denise had already cataloged them. Laurel still made Nate identify every relevant page himself. She separated the documents into 3 categories: the forged signatures, the forms altered after signing, the papers Nate had signed while incomplete. She did not allow him to speak about all 3 in the same tone. "This one is not yours?" "No." "This one?" "The signature is mine. The project description was added later." "Can you prove that?" "My company copy has the description field blank." "And this?" Nate looked at the final page. "I signed it as presented." "Was the work complete?" "Part of it." "Then why certify all of it?" Nate rubbed the old pale mark where his wedding ring had once rested. "Because Byron said the appendix would break out the remaining work." "Did you read the appendix?" "It wasn't attached." Laurel tapped the pen twice. "Then you certified a document you knew was incomplete." "Yes." She did not reward the answer. That was one reason Nate trusted her. After nearly 2 hours, Laurel switched off the recorder. "I am requesting preservation of records connected to Mercy's operating fund, the Perpetual Care Trust, Everpeace prepaid contracts, and all vendors listed in the facility improvement accounts." "Will they have to turn them over?" "If the request becomes an order." "And Byron?" "He will be notified through counsel." "That gives him time." "It gives him due process." Nate looked at the boxes. "Those 2 things don't always feel different." "They are very different when someone investigates you." He had no answer to that. Laurel closed the folder. One more name, Roland Pike. Nate had seen it only on payment schedules. "Everpeace accountant?" "Contract accountant, 47. His firms appear on several transfers." "Firms?" 3 registered companies, 1 office suite, 2 mail drops." "What does he say they do?" "So far, accounting support, contractor coordination, and document reconciliation." "That is a lot of language for moving money." Laurel stood. Language is often hired before the money is. Outside the municipal building, Kilo waited in Nate's truck with Moses. The dog wore a forest green winter coat, and the back seat had been padded with 2 folded blankets to ease his stiff leg. Moses handed Nate the red thermos cap as he climbed in. Nate smelled it. "No." "You look pale." "I've been questioned for 2 hours." "Then your judgment may be improved." Nate pushed the cup back. Moses drank it without visible injury. Over the next week, Everpeace changed its tone without ever becoming openly hostile. The company sent letters to several older residents stating that active disputes could delay administrative verification of burial agreements. The phrasing did not threaten cancellation. It simply advised clients that unresolved documentation might affect future scheduling. Marjorie Pell called Denise and withdrew permission to use her contract. Calvin Rusk stopped answering the phone. 2 other families said they wanted no further contact until their services had been confirmed in writing. Byron never called Nate directly. His attorney did. The message thanked Nate for his previous consideration and expressed concern that incomplete public statements might damage community confidence in services many residents still depended upon. Nate listened twice. The words contained no anger. That was their strength. Jude returned to Bristle Point on a Thursday afternoon. She arrived in a deep teal parka with her brown-gray hair tied low at the nape of her neck. A leather document bag hung across one shoulder. Nate saw her first outside Denise's office, where she stood beneath the pharmacy awning, sorting color-coded tabs into a folder. For a moment, neither moved. 5 years earlier, he would have searched her face for evidence that she missed him. Now he noticed she looked tired from driving. "You came," he said. "I said I would." "That used to be my line." "You usually meant eventually." There was no cruelty in it. Jude no longer needed cruelty to make the truth land. She had brought volunteer schedules, meal delivery records, and contact information for several people who once attended consultation days at Mercy Chapel. More importantly, She remembered who had been asked to leave rooms before documents were signed. They spent the afternoon calling former volunteers. Some remembered Byron as charming. Others remembered tissue packets placed beside every contract and bottled water arranged with labels facing outward. One woman recalled being told that privacy protected elderly clients from family pressure. Jude ended the call and stared at her notes. He made kindness look procedural. He made procedure look kind, Nate said. She looked at him. That too. Later, they carried boxes from Denise's office to Nate's truck. The sidewalk had begun icing over. Nate reached for Jude's arm when her boot slipped, but she steadied herself before he touched her. The movement left his hand suspended between them. He lowered it. "I'm not trying to make this about us," he said. "Good. I know how that sounds. It sounds like something you say when you are worried it already is." Nate leaned against the truck bed. "I keep wanting to fix everything at once." "You always did." "You hated that." "I hated that you called it fixing when you meant controlling the order in which everyone was allowed to be upset." He looked toward the front seat, where Kilo watched them through the windshield. "I don't want to do that again." Jude closed the last storage box. "Then do not turn this into a story where you save the town." "What should I turn it into?" "Nothing." The answer surprised him. "Tell the truth. Let other people decide what it becomes." She walked around the truck. Nate remained by the tailgate. It was the first advice she had given him in years that did not feel like a door opening or closing, only a direction. Because Mercy Chapel remained sealed, Moses suggested a public gathering in the small square beside the cemetery. "It has benches," Denise said. "It has 4 benches," Moses replied. 3 are frozen and 1 belongs to pigeons. "We need chairs." Moses looked at Nate. Nate looked at his truck. That was how, on a Saturday morning washed in hard sunlight, 40 folding chairs traveled through Bristle Point beneath a blue tarp. Snow covered the square. Volunteers shoveled a wide path between the road and the registration table. Jude arranged blankets and thermoses of tea. Denise placed plain language information sheets beneath metal clips so the wind would not carry them into the cemetery. Laurel stood away from the tables in her dark utility coat. She had refused a microphone. "This is not an interview session," she told Denise. "People may speak publicly if they choose. I will listen." Kilo lay on a thick mat near the first row. His green coat covered most of his back, though his silvered muzzle remained lifted toward each arriving person. Nate kept a bowl of water nearby and did not ask the dog to move unless necessary. At first, the gathering resembled a badly attended winter yard sale. People spoke quietly. Several chairs remained empty. Some residents circled the square before entering, as though they had come only to check the weather. Marjorie arrived carrying her purple document pouch. She sat in the second row and held it against her chest. When Denise invited anyone to speak, Vernon Hale rose first. He wore his moss-brown wool coat and tweed cap. A silver mechanical pencil rested in one gloved hand. "These contracts contain repeated processing codes," he said. "That does not prove every transaction is fraudulent. It proves the claim that each agreement was independently processed is false." He displayed copies of the codes in neat columns. No dramatic accusation followed. Vernon trusted numbers to remain standing after emotion sat down. A widow named Ruth Elkins spoke next. She was 79, with a broad face, a white braid tucked beneath a navy hat, and a voice stronger than her small frame suggested. "I do not want a refund," she said. "I want it written down that nobody can make another person buy the same grave twice." Denise noted the request. Ruth looked toward the sealed chapel. "My husband is already buried. Money does not disturb him. Being treated like a fool disturbs me." A few people laughed softly. The laughter loosened something in the square. Marjorie still did not rise. Her hands had begun trembling around the document pouch. Kilo lifted his head. Nate saw the dog look first toward Marjorie, then toward him. He did not signal. He only shifted the water bowl aside so Kilo had a clear path. The German shepherd stood with effort, his right hind leg slow beneath him. He crossed the short distance and lowered himself beside Marjorie's boots. She looked down. "Oh, you old traitor," she whispered. "You know I brought biscuits?" Kilo rested his head against the side of her shoe. Marjorie's shoulders dropped. When she stood, one hand remained lightly on his back. "Mr. Sedgwick never said he would move my husband's ashes," she began. "He said repairs might require relocation and that older agreements did not guarantee the same place afterward." Her voice faltered. No one interrupted. I knew he was being careful with the words. I signed anyway because I could not bear the thought that my husband might be placed somewhere I did not know. She looked toward Denise. I was ashamed because I thought fear made me stupid. From the front row, Ruth said, "Fear makes people afraid." Marjorie almost smiled. She finished speaking. When she sat, Kilo remained beside her. Near the back of the square, Celia Brandt appeared. Nate recognized her from an old Mercy board photograph. At 64, Celia was smaller than he expected, with a square face and white hair cut close in a neat pixie. She wore a dusty blue wool coat and held a red accounting ledger against her body. She had not registered. She stood beyond the chairs until Moses walked over and placed an empty seat beside the final row. Celia did not take it. "I approve the transfers," she said. The square became still. Laurel's eyes sharpened, but she did not move closer. Celia held the ledger tighter. Whenever peace came in, Mercy was short on operating funds. The chapel roof leaked. The cemetery equipment needed repair. Byron said the facility projects would stabilize everything. "Did you know the invoices were false?" Denise asked. "Not at first." "And later?" Celia looked down at the ledger. "Later, I knew the numbers did not match." "Why did you stay quiet?" "Because my name was on the approvals." The answer came quickly, as though she had spent years preparing it. "I thought if I reported the transfers, people would believe I had stolen the money. Then every month I waited made the previous month harder to explain." She opened the red ledger. "I kept copies." Celia did not present herself as a hero. She did not ask anyone to understand. She simply walked to Laurel and handed over the book. At the edge of the square, Nate felt something settle inside him. Celia had made the same mistake in a different room. She had confused delay with protection until delay became participation. Moses called Nate's name. It was his turn. Nate stood before the chairs without notes. He wore his olive field jacket over a blue-gray shirt, his work boots cleaned but visibly old. The winter sun made the silver at his temples brighter. He looked at the people whose contracts had carried his company name. "Some signatures were forged," he said. "Some documents were changed after I signed them." He paused. "Some signatures were mine." No one shifted. "I signed forms without complete attachments. My company received coordination fees from invoices that were later inflated. I did not understand the whole system, but I had a responsibility to understand the papers I certified." He did not mention his father's death. He did not mention the divorce. Those facts were true. They were also not the point. "I should have checked. I did not." Marjorie watched him. Vernon's pencil remained still. "I am cooperating with the state review. I may lose my license. I may have to return money. I am not asking anyone here to tell me I meant well." The cold air tightened around his lungs. "I meant to finish paperwork and go home. That was enough to help someone else make the paperwork look honest." He stepped back. No applause followed. Nate was grateful. Moses unfolded a page taken from Opal's final letter. His reading glasses sat low on his nose. "Opal wrote this before she died," he said. Dignity is not only what people keep while they are strong. Sometimes dignity is what another person protects when someone has grown too tired to keep arguing. The wind lifted one corner of the paper. Moses held it down with his thumb. Laurel waited until the gathering had ended and the oldest attendees had been helped to warm cars. Then she addressed the remaining group. The statements and records provided today, combined with the documents already submitted, establish sufficient grounds to seek formal preservation of financial records and begin a broader audit. A murmur moved through the square. Laurel raised one hand. This does not guarantee recovery. The murmur stopped. Some funds pass through multiple entities. Some records may be incomplete. Some money may never be returned. The truth disappointed people differently than hope had encouraged them. But no one left. Nate began folding chairs. Jude joined him without speaking. Moses carried blankets. Denise secured the registration sheets. Celia sat alone in the final row, staring at the empty place where her ledger had rested. Kilo remained beside Marjorie until her ride arrived. The morning hadn't ended with justice. It had ended with names, signatures, and frightened people choosing to be recorded together. For the first time, what happened to each of them no longer looked like an isolated mistake. By the time the snow began pulling away from the south-facing roofs of Bristle Point, the case against Everpeace had become too large for any one room. There was no single trial where every answer arrived at once. Instead, the truth moved through 3 separate doors. The Mercy Board held public meetings to decide whether Everpeace's contract should be terminated. The State Funeral Services Regulator opened an administrative hearing on the company's license. Laurel Venn and a team of auditors followed money through trust accounts, contractor payments, and prepaid burial agreements, forwarding anything that suggested criminal conduct to prosecutors. Each process required different records. Each process moved at a different speed. That frustrated Nate more than he admitted. He had spent most of his life repairing things that revealed their failure honestly. A seized bearing gave heat. A cracked vent leaked. A furnace either started or it did not. Institutions could remain broken while continuing to produce forms, proving they were functional. The first Mercy Board meeting was held in the township library because the chapel remained sealed. Folding tables stood beneath fluorescent lights, and framed photographs of Bristle Point's fishing history watched from the walls. Byron Sedgwick arrived 5 minutes early. He wore a midnight blue suit, a white shirt, and a pale silver tie. His steel-gray hair had been combed neatly back from his forehead. He greeted the board members by name, asked after one man's recovery from surgery, and thanked the librarian for allowing the meeting to use the room. Nothing about him appeared hurried. That was part of his authority. He did not look like a man defending a system that had frightened elderly people into paying twice. He looked like the man hired to explain why everyone else had misunderstood the paperwork. His attorney, Martin Creel, sat beside him. Creel was in his early 60s, tall and narrow, with a soft voice and a habit of folding his hands before asking questions that were not gentle. He did not accuse Nate directly. He built doubt, one careful piece at a time. When Nate took his seat before the board, Creel began with the business. Drummond Mechanical ceased full operations after a period of financial difficulty, correct? Yes. You were behind on supplier payments. For several months. You had recently lost your father. Yes. Your marriage was failing. Nate looked toward the board. Yes. You were sleeping poorly. Yes. Creel allowed a small pause. And during that period, you signed documents you now say you did not fully review. Yes. So your memory of the work was impaired at the time. My judgment was. That was not my question. My memory was uneven. Creel nodded as though Nate had offered exactly what he needed. Yet today, years later, you're asking this board to rely on your recollection over written contracts. No. Creel's expression shifted slightly. Nate continued, "I am asking the board to compare the contracts with purchase orders, site conditions, bank records, and my company copies. Because your memory alone is unreliable." "Yes?" The answer removed the argument before Creel could sharpen it. Nate did not try to appear stronger than he had been. That became his strength. Creel turned to one of the invoices. "This signature is yours." "Yes?" "And the company received a coordination fee." "Yes." "So you benefited financially?" "Yes." "Were you part of a conspiracy?" "No." "Then which should the board believe? That you knowingly participated, or that you were too careless to understand your own documents?" A year earlier, Nate might have heard humiliation in the question and answered with anger. Now he heard only the trap. "Careless," he said, "and sometimes willing not to ask, because asking would have slowed the work." The room remained still. "That does not make me innocent of my part. It also does not make the altered invoices legitimate." Creel's folded hands separated. For the first time, Byron looked directly at Nate. The funeral services hearing took place 2 weeks later in a state office building south of Traverse City. Byron spoke there. He described Everpeace as a company founded to help aging communities navigate increasingly complicated burial regulations. He said many clients misunderstood administrative renewals as duplicate purchases. He described the confidentiality clauses as standard settlement language intended to protect private family matters. "Preparation is often mistaken for pressure," he said, "especially when people are discussing death." His tone remained respectful. He never called the complainants confused. He did not need to. His language placed confusion around them like a clean white cloth. Then Vernon Hale testified. He wore a dark brown coat and carried 3 binders labeled in block letters. At 81, Vernon required more time to reach the witness table than Byron had. He refused assistance. Once seated, he opened the first binder. "These contracts are represented as separate transactions," he said. "They are not processed separately." He showed the repeated numerical codes, identical formatting errors, and the same hidden reference number embedded in agreements issued months apart. Byron's attorney suggested that template systems commonly reused internal numbers. Vernon adjusted his bifocals. "A template may repeat a heading. It should not assign the same unique transaction number to 5 unrelated payments unless uniqueness has acquired a new mathematical meaning." A few people in the room smiled. The hearing officer did not, but she asked Byron's attorney to explain the repeated codes. He could not do so immediately. Jude testified later that afternoon. She did not describe Byron as cruel. She described procedure. Volunteers were invited to assist elderly residents with transportation and meals. Once contract discussions began, they were asked to leave. Byron called this privacy. Jude had noted that several clients became visibly anxious afterward. She produced the old volunteer schedules. Dates matched Marjorie's contract, Ruth Elkins's consultation, 2 meetings recorded in Opal's calendar. Jude did not look toward Nate while speaking. She was not there to confirm his version. She was there to provide her own. That distinction mattered. The strongest financial evidence came from Celia Brandt. Laurel's auditors verified that Celia's red ledger matched portions of the Mercy account records. The transfers had moved through facility improvement accounts before reaching companies created or managed by Roland Pike. Roland appeared in person only after his attorney negotiated terms for cooperation. He was 47, thin through the shoulders, with a narrow face and black rectangular glasses. His gray suit was slightly too large. He carried a laptop bag he never opened and cleaned his glasses each time a question required more than a technical answer. He had never met Marjorie. He had never spoken with Opal. That distance had become his defense. "My role was accounting architecture," he said. Laurel sat across from him during the recorded interview. What does that mean? Structuring vendor payment pathways, moving money, processing authorized transfers, through 3 companies registered to the same office suite. Administrative efficiency? Laurel tapped her pen twice. Mr. Pike, did those companies perform boiler work? No. Fire system upgrades? Not directly. Cemetery maintenance? They coordinated vendors. Name one. Roland looked at his attorney. The attorney nodded once. Roland removed his glasses. There were no vendors. The companies issued invoices, retained portions of the payments, and transferred the remainder through accounts linked to Everpeace operations. Funds from prepaid burial agreements had been used to cover shortfalls elsewhere, then hidden beneath facility charges. Roland eventually provided access credentials, payment spreadsheets, and email archives. He did not become brave. He became afraid of being left with all the blame. The evidence still mattered. By early April, the funeral services regulator suspended Everpeace's license pending final action. Prosecutors announced charges involving fraud, misuse of trust funds, falsification of business records, and deceptive consumer practices. Byron remained composed when he left the building. Reporters called questions from behind a barrier. He answered none. Roland lowered his head and followed his attorney. Celia was not charged as an organizer, but she was required to cooperate fully and faced civil consequences for approving transfers and failing to disclose irregularities after discovering them. Nate received his own notice 3 days later. His contractor's license would be temporarily suspended during professional review. His insurer opened a claim process. He was required to calculate and return the coordination fees his company had retained from the inflated invoices. The amount was not enough to ruin him. It was enough to matter. He read the notice twice at the kitchen table. Kilo lay near the stove, asleep beneath the forest green coat Nate had removed after their walk. Medication had eased the inflammation in his hind leg, though cold mornings still made the first steps difficult. Moses sat across from Nate with his thermos. "So," Moses said, "how clean is your record now?" Nate folded the notice. "It has become historically interesting." "Collectors may value it?" Nate looked at Kilo. He clearly chose the smarter man for those 5 years. Moses considered the dog. The competition was limited. Nate laughed before he could stop himself. The sound startled Kilo awake. The old shepherd lifted his head, saw no danger, and lowered it again. For a moment, the room held no hearing, no ledger, and no accusation. Only a bad joke allowed to remain a joke. After Everpeace was removed from Mercy's operations, the practical problem arrived. The chapel still needed repairs. The boiler had to be replaced. The venting required reconstruction. The alarm system needed inspection. The nonprofit's accounts were partly frozen during the audit, and public confidence had collapsed. Nate proposed selling the remaining assets of Drummond Mechanical. He made the announcement in Denise's office as though he were presenting a completed repair plan. "I can cover most of the work," he said, "equipment, labor, inspections." Jude sat near the window, reviewing grant forms. "No." Nate looked at her. "You haven't seen the estimate." "I do not need to. It solves the immediate problem. It makes you the solution. I'm offering money. You're offering control in a generous coat." Denise lowered her pen but did not intervene. Nate felt the old heat rise in him. "It is my money. And your decision, your schedule, your sacrifice. Then everyone has to be grateful in the correct order." "That's not what I'm doing." Jude met his eyes. "It is what you always do when guilt becomes unbearable. You take on something so large that nobody is allowed to question the method because the effort looks noble." The room went quiet. Nate wanted to reject the accusation. Instead, he looked at the estimate in his hand. He had already chosen contractors, already created a timeline, already decided which work should happen first. No one had asked him to. "What would you do?" he asked. Jude's expression softened, though only slightly. "Return the money you received incorrectly." "I will." "Offer your labor where the licensing review allows." "Yes." "Help apply for grants." "All right." "And let a board decide the rest." Nate disliked the last part immediately. That told him she was right. The new Mercy Restoration Fund was formed over the next month. Its temporary board included 2 older residents, Denise as legal advisor, a cemetery representative, an independent accountant, and a local building inspector who agreed to review every major expense. Nate was not given a voting seat. He attended anyway. At the first meeting, Vernon asked why one proposed circulation pump cost 14% more than a comparable model. Nate explained the warranty and cold weather rating. Vernon requested documentation. Nate provided it. Nobody thanked him for tolerating the question. That was also progress. Celia helped reconstruct older account histories under Laurel's supervision. Jude coordinated grant applications and volunteer schedules. Moses inspected the cemetery equipment, but refused any title containing the word consultant. "I have survived retirement once," he said. "I will not risk it again." Nate returned the improperly retained fees. He worked under the supervision of a licensed contractor, removing damaged vent sections, documenting serial numbers, and photographing every stage before anything was sealed inside a wall. Every invoice was posted publicly. Every change order required 2 approvals. At first, Nate found the process painfully slow. Then one afternoon, he watched Ruth Elkins compare a repair bill with the original estimate and ask why 2 labor hours had been added. The contractor explained. Ruth accepted the answer. No one treated her question as distrust. It was simply oversight. Nate began to understand that trust was not the absence of verification. It was what verification made possible. In late April, the county inspector returned to Mercy Chapel. Snow remained only in narrow shadows beside the cemetery wall. Water dripped from the eaves. The first crocuses pushed through dark soil near the walkway. The inspector tested the new boiler, checked the vent draft, triggered each alarm circuit, and reviewed the posted permits. Then he removed the red closure notice from the side entrance. Mercy Chapel was authorized to reopen on a limited basis. No contract consultations. No handling of prepaid funds. Only community meetings, memorial services, and supervised administrative work. Moses held the removed notice by one corner. "Frame it?" he asked. "Burn it," Nate said. "Evidence," Denise replied. Moses folded it carefully. The front doors remained closed while final cleaning continued, but the side entrance stood open. Kilo walked inside first. He moved slowly across the old floor, paused near the room where Opal once waited for appointments, and lay down in a square of spring sunlight. Nate stood in the doorway. The boiler had been replaced. The alarms worked. The building was safer than it had been in years. Still, when the wind moved through the cemetery trees, the chapel sounded empty. Nate understood why. A machine could be replaced in a week. A record could be corrected with evidence. Trust required people to return voluntarily. That repair had only begun. Almost a year passed before winter returned to Bristle Point. It came quietly at first. A thin white line appeared along the cemetery wall one November morning. By December, snow covered the rooftops, the chapel steps, and the branches of the pines overlooking Lake Michigan. The lake itself had not frozen completely, but pale ice gathered along the shore in broken sheets that caught the morning light. Mercy Chapel no longer carried a county seal across its doors. The old notices had been removed months earlier. The boiler ran without complaint. Every alarm circuit had been tested twice. A brass plate beside the entrance listed the building's new purpose in plain language: community guidance and memorial support. No contract sales, no financial signatures required. Nate had argued against the brass plate. He thought the wording sounded severe. Ruth Elkins had told him severity was useful when people had spent years being confused politely. The plate remained. Inside, the chapel looked familiar, without feeling restored to the past. The narrow sanctuary still held its old wooden pews, but the side rooms had changed. One became a consultation space with 2 large windows and a round table, rather than a desk dividing one person from another. Another held filing cabinets, public records, and printed guides explaining burial trusts, prepaid agreements, wills, cemetery rights, and the right to bring a friend, relative, attorney, or volunteer into any discussion. No one could be asked to sign a contract on the same day it was first presented. Every financial document had to be reviewed by 2 independent people. Every payment from the Mercy Restoration Fund appeared on a public ledger mounted near the office. Vernon Hale checked it every Tuesday. He claimed this was civic duty. Moses claimed Vernon simply enjoyed finding misplaced decimal points. Both were probably correct. A small framed photograph of Opal Hensley stood in the reception room. She was seated on her porch in a summer dress, one hand resting on Kilo's shoulder. The dog looked younger, his muzzle dark, his left ear already carrying its small triangular notch. Beside the photograph lay the blue-gray glove Kilo had carried to the chapel nearly a year earlier. There was no plaque praising Opal, no marble memorial, only an empty chair near the window. The chair remained available for anyone who needed to sit before making a difficult decision. Nate had repaired one loose joint beneath the seat and documented the work on a maintenance form countersigned by the building inspector. He did not find that excessive anymore. After his license suspension ended, Nate did not reopen Drummond Mechanical as it had been. The old company name still existed for insurance and settlement purposes, but he worked under supervised maintenance agreements with Mercy Chapel and 2 community buildings. Every inspection report passed through another set of hands. Every invoice required review. At first, the process had felt like a public reminder of failure. Then, Nate noticed something he had missed for most of his working life. Good oversight did not accuse him. It protected everyone from needing perfect judgment every day. That included him. On the morning before the chapel's full winter reopening, Nate stood in the maintenance room wearing his olive combat shirt beneath a dark work vest. A red carpenter's pencil rested behind one ear. He checked the boiler pressure, wrote the reading in a black notebook, and signed only after completing every line. Moses appeared in the doorway with his red thermos. "You missed a spot." Nate looked at the form. "Where?" "Top right corner." "That is the manufacturer's logo." "Still looks unfinished." Moses had officially retired from night duty in October. He continued arriving at the cemetery before sunrise, often enough that no one understood what retirement had changed. He wore the same faded navy coat and carried the same impossible coffee. The large ring of keys no longer belonged to him, though he still had opinions about each one. Nate closed the notebook. "You are not employed here." "I'm supervising." "You are specifically not supervising." "Then your mistakes are entirely voluntary." Nate took the thermos cap Moses offered, smelled the contents, and handed it back. "You brewed this through a work sock." "Clean one?" "That does not improve the case." From the hallway came the slow click of nails against wood. Kilo entered, wearing his forest green winter coat. He was 11 now. Silver covered most of his muzzle, and the stiffness in his right hind leg lasted longer on cold mornings. Nate had placed rubber-backed runners along the hall so the dog would not slip. Kilo stopped beside Moses. Moses scratched the fur beneath his collar. "At least one of you appreciates me." Kilo sniffed the thermos and turned away. Nate nodded. Strong testimony. The old shepherd chose where he slept now. Some nights he stayed at Nate's house, on a thick bed beside the stove. Other nights he settled in the former caretaker's room when Moses remained late. On quiet afternoons he lay near Opal's empty chair and watched snow move across the cemetery. For months after Opal's death, Kilo had returned to her porch. Lorna kept the house through spring while settling the estate. Nate drove Kilo there whenever the dog became restless. He never rushed the visits. Sometimes Kilo stood at the front door for several minutes. Sometimes he lay beside the window and refused to leave until dusk. By summer, he stopped waiting at the chair. By autumn, he no longer needed Opal's glove to climb into Nate's truck. Nate did not mark the day. Trust lost its meaning when measured too eagerly. Jude arrived just before noon. She had spent much of the previous year traveling between Traverse City and Bristle Point, helping build volunteer procedures and reviewing educational materials. Now that the system was functioning without her, she planned to return fully to her work up north. Nate found her outside the chapel beneath a slow fall of snow. She wore her deep teal parka and carried the cognac leather bag that seemed capable of holding every form in Michigan. Her brown-gray hair was tied low beneath a knitted hat. "You're leaving today?" Nate asked. "After lunch. The roads may ice." "I checked." "Of course you did." Jude looked toward the open chapel doors. "It looks good." That sounded almost complimentary. It was. Try not to damage it by examining it too closely. They stood beneath the eave. A year earlier, silence between them had been crowded with arguments waiting to restart. This silence had more room. Nate put his hands into his jacket pockets. "I owe you an apology." Jude looked at him but said nothing. He continued before the old instinct to qualify the statement could return. "I made you carry every difficult conversation until you were too tired to keep asking. When you noticed something wrong at Mercy, I treated your concern like a flaw in you." Snow gathered on the shoulders of his jacket. "I was wrong." Jude waited. Nate did not add that he had been grieving. He did not mention his father, the failing business, or exhaustion. Those things remained true. They did not belong inside the apology. "You stayed this time," Jude said. "Not soon enough." "No." The word was gentle but firm. She looked across the cemetery. "I used to think closure meant we would finally agree on what happened." Nate followed her gaze. "What does it mean now?" "That we can remember it without asking the other person to carry our version." He nodded. Jude adjusted the strap of her bag. "I am glad you found Kilo." Nate looked through the window. The shepherd had settled beside Opal's chair. He wasn't waiting to be found. "No." "I think that was the first useful thing he taught me." Jude smiled faintly. "He taught you several useful things before. You were not always an excellent student." "That sounds like Moses." "Moses has had a year to influence me." They did not embrace. They did not promise to call more often. Jude touched Nate's arm once before stepping toward her car. "Thank you for finally staying in the conversation." Nate watched her leave. The moment did not feel like losing her again. It felt like setting down something they had both carried long after it stopped belonging to either of them. That afternoon, the volunteers prepared for the reopening. Denise arranged informational brochures. Vernon reviewed the public ledger. Ruth tested every chair for wobbling and rejected 2. Lorna placed fresh flowers beside Opal's photograph, then moved them farther from the glove so moisture would not damage the wool. Moses argued with the new coffee machine. "It has too many buttons," he said. "It has one button," Nate replied. "It is not responding to leadership." "You have to add water." Machines used to possess initiative. Kilo lay beneath the reception window, apparently unwilling to involve himself. The official reopening began the following morning. The snow had stopped during the night. Sunlight spread across the cemetery and made the white ground shine so brightly that visitors narrowed their eyes as they approached. There was no ceremony, no ribbon, no speech about defeating corruption. The first hour passed with only 3 visitors. A woman asked about transferring an old cemetery deed into a family trust. A retired factory worker wanted someone to explain the difference between a prepaid service and a burial insurance policy. An elderly couple came simply to see whether the chapel doors were truly open. Then a man named Harold Pritchard entered, carrying a brown envelope. He was 78, tall but stooped, with a narrow face and carefully combed white hair. Snow had melted along the shoulders of his wool coat. He held the envelope with both hands. "My wife signed something last month," he said. Nate invited him into the consultation room. Harold sat across from the empty chair near the window, but did not remove the document. "My wife has dementia," he said. "Some days she understands everything. Some days she does not know the house." Nate waited. "A company representative visited while I was at the pharmacy. She signed a prepaid plan." Harold's fingers tightened around the envelope. "I do not know whether to cancel it. I do not know whether she understood. I do not know whether questioning it means I am taking away one of the last choices she made for herself." The words came slowly. Then they stopped. Nate could have opened the envelope. He could have explained capacity standards, cancellation periods, witness requirements, and the right to independent review. All of that information waited in the filing cabinet behind him. He did not reach for it. Kilo rose from beside the window. The dog crossed the room with the careful pace age now required. He stopped beside Harold and lowered himself near the man's boots. Harold looked down. Is he friendly? When he decides to be. Kilo rested his head on his front paws. Harold reached toward him, hesitated, then placed one hand lightly on the dog's shoulder. The room stayed quiet. Outside, Moses accused the coffee machine of withholding evidence. A phone vibrated on Nate's desk. Jude had sent a message. How did the morning go? Nate turned the screen face down. Harold looked at the envelope again. "I feel foolish," he said. "You're not. I should know what to do." "Why?" "I'm her husband." Nate leaned back in his chair. "That means you care what happens. It does not mean you have to understand every form before someone explains it." Harold's hand moved slowly across Kilo's coat. "What happens now?" "Nothing today unless you want it to." Harold looked up. Nate continued. "We can read the agreement together. Denise can review the legal parts. You can take it home. You can ask someone else to sit with you. You do not have to decide while you are afraid." The man's grip loosened. Nate pointed toward the empty chair beside the window. "That chair stays open for anyone you want here." Harold nodded. After several minutes, he placed the envelope on the table. Nate still did not open it. "Take your time," he said. "We have enough today." Sunlight crossed the floor and reached Kilo's paws. In the reception room, Opal's photograph stood beside the old glove. Moses continued losing an argument with Modern Coffee. Vernon was asking why a box of printer paper cost $4 more than the quoted price. The chapel was not peaceful because nothing was wrong. It was peaceful because no one was required to hide what was wrong in order to remain welcome. Nate looked at Kilo. The old shepherd was not searching for evidence. He was not waiting to be rescued. He was simply staying beside a man who could not yet begin. For years, Nate had believed redemption would feel like a verdict. A moment when the past was measured, the debt calculated, and someone finally declared that he had done enough. Instead, it looked like ordinary work, reading the whole page, letting another person check the numbers, refusing to profit from fear, leaving an empty chair, keeping a door open, and remaining long enough for someone else to find the words. Sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is not rescue anyone, but tell the whole truth about the harm they helped make possible. Nate could not undo every signature, recover every dollar, or return the years Kilo spent away. But he learned that grace does not always erase the past. Sometimes it gives us the strength to stop hiding from it and to make the next choice with honesty. In everyday life, that choice may be as simple as reading carefully, listening without rushing, or staying beside someone who is too tired to speak. What part of Nate and Kilo's journey stayed with you? Please share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more stories about loyalty, responsibility, and second chances. May God give you courage when truth is costly and peace when doing the right thing takes time.